Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. In our last episode, we met the 5th century poet, Paulinus of Nola. He was a gregarious monk, and later a bishop, whose life intersected with the lives of so many great names of his age, in the secular world and in the church. His biography is well attested by sources well known. In today's episode, we look at a man who superficially had much in common with Paulinus. His name was Prudentius, and like Paulinus, he was a poet. Like Paulinus, he was a provincial nobleman with family ties to Spain. Like Paulinus, he was a lawyer and rhetorician trained in the classics and successful in public service. Like Paulinus, he served as a provincial governor, and one day, again, like Paulinus, he experienced a crisis that provoked him to change his life. Paulinus and Prudentius had much in common, and yet they were very different men, producing very different poetry. They lived in the first flush of excitement for Christian poetry. From the time of the apostles, believers had expressed the faith in poems and hymns. The New Testament includes snatches of such verse, especially in the letters of St. Paul and the book of Revelation. In subsequent generations, poems were produced for the liturgy. The Gloria, which is still sung at Mass today, probably emerged in the 1st or 2nd century AD, and it had many imitators. Others appeared in the centuries that followed, but there was an explosion of activity in all the arts in the 4th century. Christianity was newly legal, and Christians could openly express their faith in various artistic forms. The quality was sometimes wanting, but the efforts were earnest. Around 330 AD, Juvencus took the words of the Gospels and hammered them into lines of dactylic hexameter, the form usually associated with classical epics. He hewed closely to the original texts, and he strove, in plodding, regular, monotonous lines, to make the Gospels easier to commit to memory. The poet Proba was up to something else. She was the earliest female Christian poet whose work has survived. Proba wrote in the form of the cento. A curious exercise, the cento challenged poets to fashion an entirely new poem out of lines and half-lines taken from the Roman poet Virgil. Proba's finished product was 694 lines that bear the title Cento Virgilianus de Laudibus Christi, a Virgilian cento about the glories of Christ. Both Juvencus and Proba were in for the long game, but others wrote brief lyric poems. The Christian best known for his epigrams was Pope Damasus I, who reigned from 366 to 384. Damasus composed many of his verses as epitaphs for the tombs of the martyrs. They were rather prosaic and dense with historical and biographical information, but many have survived because they were literally carved into stone. Other poets of the period produced catechetical and liturgical verse. Much of it survives and is of great historical value. But at the end of the 4th century, we find something genuinely new in the world. We find a sudden surge of Christian poetry of great literary and artistic value. Paulinus was an important figure in this movement, as was his teacher Ausonius. Ambrose brought about important developments in the writing of hymns, and he produced a number of undisputed masterpieces. And even Augustine wrote at least one poem that is universally recognized as a masterpiece. But the greatest poet of them all was Prudentius. He hailed from Spain, and several cities vie for the honor of his birthplace. It is clear from his poems that he received an excellent classical education, and he suffered for it. In the preface to his collected works, he remembers the harshness of his schooling, where lessons were enforced by the beatings of his teachers. "I wept in boyhood," he says, "'neath the sounding rod." Nevertheless, he excelled in the arts of rhetoric, and as an adult he made a name for himself in the practice of law. He was troubled, though, by the dishonesty of the trade. He said, "I plied, and with deceitful pleading sinned." But he kept advancing by every worldly measure. Prudentius alludes vaguely to other sins of his young life, which he calls fouled and polluted manhood's opening bloom. Yet again, these did not slow his meteoric rise in government. He came to the attention of the Emperor Theodosius and was summoned to the capital, and twice he was assigned to serve as a provincial governor. He went from glory to glory, and unlike Paulinus, he never seems to have experienced a precipitous fall or a catastrophic betrayal. No, his crisis came quietly. One day, he came to see the absurdity of his life thus far. He had advanced in law by making arguments he knew to be untrue, in defense of people he knew to be guilty. He had won respect because of his association with powerful men who would soon be dead and turned to dust and forgotten. So would all his own accomplishments soon be vanished. He asked himself the hard question, "Yet what avail the prizes or the blows of fortune when the body's spark is quenched, and death annuls whatever state I held?" Prudentius was probably in his mid-40s when he decided to retire and take up a life of study and ascetical rigor. But he would do this in a most unconventional way. In his moment of crisis, he did not discern, as others had, a vocation to serve the church and its clergy or its poor. He looked back upon his early years and noted that he had no good works to offer, nor did he have a fortune he could spend in the Lord's service. Yet now, he wrote, "Ere hence I pass, my sinning soul shall doff its folly and shall praise my Lord, if not by deeds, at least with humble lips." His calling was to be a poet in service of Jesus Christ and the Catholic faith, and he would be faithful to that call through all his remaining years. Almost everything we know of Prudentius is what we find in his poems. He wrote without the reward of notice. Whereas Paulinus of Nola is discussed by the greatest names of the 5th century, not a single mention of Prudentius appears in any of the works of any of his contemporaries. He ate little then, and dedicated himself entirely to his art. In the years that followed, he wrote many hymns and poems. Not a word of his has been preserved except what he cast in verse. Some of his works are quite large in scale and in ambition. He was a consummate craftsman. Having mastered all the classical forms, he began to innovate, producing distinctively Christian variations on the ancient themes. Historians of literature say he wrote the first book-length allegorical poem, and he wrote the first true Christian epic. Around 13 years into his retirement, in the year 405, he gathered together everything he had written thus far. There were 6 major works of substantial length. He tells us that he was 57 years old at the time. He seems to have produced only one major work after publishing his collection. 3 of his works have had a profound and lasting influence on Christian culture ever since, and we'll take a close look at those. They are his Liber Cathemeron, his Liber Peristephanon, and his Psychomachia. Though Prudentius wrote all his poems in Latin, he gave them Greek titles, as was the fashion among poets in his day. The title of the Cathemeron simply means every day. It is a series of 14 hymns, half of which were composed to be sung at the church's appointed hours for daily prayer. Psalm 119 had declared to the Lord, "7 times a day I praise you for your righteous ordinances." And devout Christians from earliest times had devised schemes for fulfilling that promise. The Cathemeron presents lyrics that meditate upon the significance of each time of day, considered in light of nature and scripture. The hymn at cockcrow, for example, talks about the familiar practical difficulties of waking up and getting out of bed. Awake! The shining day is born, the herald cock proclaims the morn, and Christ the soul's awakener cries, bidding us back to life arise. Away the sluggard's bed, away, the slumber of the soul's decay, ye chaste and just and temperate, watch, I am standing at the gate. A little later, the verses present sleep and waking symbolically, as signs of death and life. Though sleep be put a passing guest, 'tis type of death's perpetual rest. Our sins are as a ghastly night, and seal with slumbers deep our sight. But from the wide roof of the sky, Christ's voice peals forth with urgent cry, calling our sleep-bound hearts to rise and greet the dawn with wakeful eyes. Eventually, of course, Prudentius presents the most famous biblical scene of a cock crowing after Peter's betrayal, and he applies the lessons to everyday life. He similarly presents the stational hours of sunrise, mid-morning, before lunch, after lunch, twilight, and bedtime. There are additional hymns for periods of fasting and feasting, for a time of burial and mourning, and for the feasts of Epiphany and Christmas. There is nothing monotonous about the Cathemeron. Our poet varies the meter of his hymns so that each captures the unique sense of the time of day it describes. The stanzas are rich in allusions to sacred history as well as descriptions of the natural phenomena that mark a typical day. They are designed to sanctify time, hour by hour and day by day, and thus they served to lay the foundations of a Christian culture. They conferred a common Christian meaning on sunrise, on lunch, and on burial. They proposed thoughts that many generations found to be worth their consideration. Over the centuries, the hymns of the Cathemeron found their way into the liturgy of the hours prayed by monks and nuns. Individual hymns also proved popular for parish masses, simply because they corresponded to particular times of day. The hymns in translation still appear in modern hymnals. Today, as in the 5th century, people still have a hard time waking up, and they appreciate a hymn that takes up that theme. After the Cathemeron, our next great work by Prudentius is his Peristephanon, or Crowns of the Martyrs. Like the Cathemeron, it is another series of 14 long poems, each telling the story of one or more saints who died for their faith. Their subjects include martyrs who died in Rome, in Africa, and in the poet's native land of Spain. The Peristephanon is valuable for many reasons, historical and literary. In some cases, it preserves the earliest record of the acts and legends of popular martyrs. The poems provide abundant detail about the circumstances and causes of each martyr's death. And they also record local customs for celebrating the martyrs' feasts. Perhaps most surprisingly, the poems of the Peristephanon are valuable as records of the practice of pagan religions in those waning years of the Roman Empire. Prudentius is a keen and educated observer of the phenomena of other religions, and he sets them down in some detail as the setting of earlier Christian drama. The Peristephanon has exercised a profound influence upon later Christian art, literature, and devotion. In these poems, year after year, the Church recalled the most memorable and entertaining details from the lives of the most popular saints of antiquity. It is Prudentius who tells us the story of St. Lawrence presenting the poor of the city of Rome to his captors, who had demanded to see the treasures of the Church. Well, there are the treasures of the Church, the treasures the Church holds dear. It is Prudentius who tells us that St. Lawrence, suffering on a gridiron, jokes with his torturers, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." It is Prudentius who tells us of the lustful man who was blinded because he dared to look at St. Agnes in her nakedness. Prudentius gave the Church a new way of telling the Christian story and understanding a Christian life. The martyrs had had the grace and virtue to endure the extremities of torture. In their stories, well told by a master poet, ordinary believers for centuries found the strength to persevere through their own trials and struggles. And to accomplish this, Prudentius invented a new form of poetry. The great Latinist, Frederick Raby, describes the poems of the Peristephanon as a combination of the epic and lyric, which can almost be described as a ballad. It was Prudentius who first suggested this way of telling a tale, a way that would become immensely popular in centuries to come. The Cathemeron prescribed a certain Christian understanding of time as it passed. The Peristephanon proposed models to imitate in times of suffering and persecution. But the third work we're considering by Prudentius, his Psychomachia, was something else altogether. The Psychomachia was an epic poem, and discerning critics consider it to be the first successful Christian epic. Juvencus had tried to turn the Gospels into an epic, but his lines were pedestrian and unimaginative. Proba had disassembled Virgil and put him back together for Christian purposes, but the end result was more clever than satisfying. The Psychomachia, however, was a sophisticated work of art, brilliantly conceived and executed. Like the long works of Homer and Virgil, it is a story of warfare, told as a succession of battles. But the warriors in these battles are rather unusual. Each one is the personification of a particular virtue or its opposing vice. The drama in the Psychomachia is the struggle between good and evil that takes place in every individual soul. The simple translation of the title Psychomachia is spiritual warfare. Another quirk of this epic is the fact that all of the warriors are women. Latin nouns are gendered, and all the virtues and vices are feminine. So the battles that take place in this epic are all fought exclusively by women. Otherwise, the poem follows the conventions of its ancient models. It is written in 915 lines of dactylic hexameter, the standard meter of its classical models. The spiritual warfare is portrayed often in physical terms. The generals and heroines make long speeches before or after their battles. Literary historians tell us that the Psychomachia is not only the first true Christian epic, it is also the first long poem to be written entirely as an allegory. Earlier poems had incorporated allegorical elements, and earlier readers had interpreted the epics according to allegorical methods. But the Psychomachia was the first epic to be allegorical by design. Prudentius launched a mode of literature that would rise to dominance in the Middle Ages and beyond. No less a critic than C.S. Lewis identified this work as the birth of allegory, and the great progenitor of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and Spenser's Faerie Queene. Lewis also praised Prudentius for his psychological acuity in giving character to the virtues and vices. He noted how rarely we find in classical literature any adequate recognition of the great fact of self-deception. But we find it in Prudentius. He shows us vicious avarice disguising herself as virtuous frugality as she hoards her spoil nearby. The Psychomachia was Prudentius's boldest and most innovative work. In other books he had bent one genre or another, but here he had created something entirely new, something that would inspire imitation and development for millennia afterward. We don't even know when he died, but we know his poems, and they are remarkable. It would be impossible to measure their effects on Christian culture down to our own day. So many of the visual tropes in Christian art find their origin in him. He taught us how to portray the martyrs and personify the virtues. Artists who never read a word of Prudentius were taught to render his symbols pictorially, and they still do so today. The historian Robert Wilken refers to Prudentius simply as the first Christian poet. He explains, what sets Prudentius apart from his predecessors and contemporaries is that he was a poet, and more, saw himself as a poet by profession. Some bishops had written poetry chiefly for didactic or liturgical purposes. But Prudentius was not a priest who dabbled in poetry in his spare time or wrote hymns to be sung in church. He was a layman who thought of himself as having a vocation as poet. In his words, "If I cannot give praise to God by my works, let my soul praise God with my voice." The classicist Frederick Raby concurred, saying, Prudentius was the first great representative of a real Christian literature, an artist with sure command over his form and his material. His poems are the self-conscious products of a literary age, a blending of the poetical form derived from generations of aesthetic activity with the new content of Christian thought. And Raby continues elsewhere. Prudentius uses his material as a craftsman who is making something that is his own, a body of verse which is strongly and confidently constructed and has a freshness and originality which were gifts derived from a new outlook. For the Christian idea dominates Prudentius entirely, and there is no half-regretful backward glance to antiquity. Christ had said from his throne in heaven, "Behold, I make all things new," and he eternally makes good on that promise. In Prudentius, at long last, he got around to Latin poetry.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is just one of the podcasts produced by CatholicCulture.org. To hear more from the Church Fathers in their own words, check out Catholic Culture audiobooks, readings of Catholic classics, including the Fathers and St. John Henry Newman. You might also enjoy Criteria, the Catholic film podcast, devoted to works of high artistic caliber and Catholic interest. And for interviews on a wide range of topics in Catholic arts and culture, listen to the Catholic Culture podcast.